Welcome to BAM PFA Online. My name's Kathy Garretts, and I'm one of the film curators here. We're pleased to start our online conversations up again with our first live Q&A in our annual Documentary Voices series. I'd like to welcome all of you, as well as Jeffrey Scholar's course on documentary film, which is attending all the programs in the series. We're delighted that sound artist and filmmaker Joshua Bonnetta is with us today. Back in 2017, we screened his powerful portrait of the US-Mexico border, El Mar, La Mar, which he made with J.P. Sniadecki of the Sensory Ethnography Lab. It's an honor to present his most recent film, The Hypnotic, Magical, The Two Sights, which takes us to islands off Scotland, and in its exploration and evocation of second sight is very much a meeting of his film and sound work. It's available to view on our website through the end of February. So if you haven't seen it already, I think you'll want to. Joining him in conversation is Nicolás Pereda, a filmmaker and assistant professor here at UC Berkeley in the Film and Media Department. He was our guest for a series of after-image conversations and screenings in 2011. After the conversation, Josh Bonnetta will welcome your questions. So enter them anytime in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Save chat to use to communicate among yourselves. So welcome to both of you, Josh and Nico. I'm going to turn it over to you, Nico.
Hello. Hi, thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
And thanks, Josh, for joining us for this conversation. So I actually watched the film just now again. I had seen it maybe a couple years ago, and it was like a whole new experience watching it. So I just wanted to start asking about the very beginning of this project. How did it start? How did you arrive to this place in particular? And when did the exploration of the idea of the two sides came about?
Yeah, well, thank you for doing this, and thanks, Kathy, for inviting the film. Happy to be here. So the project, it started with a residency. So I did a residency on this island called North Uist, which is one of the islands in the Outer Hebrides, a place called Tai Kersavaw, which is a arts museum, and it's a Gaelic museum, sorry, and an arts center. And initially the project started with several smaller projects that, two of them became installations, and the materials for those formed the film. So throughout it, I was thinking that, this would also become a film, but it was initiated by that. And, the kind of rationale or inspiration behind it was that, I wanted to make a film again. I make most of my films in maritime environments, but this one was particularly special to me, and I really wanted to make a film in the Outer Hebrides. And then regarding Second Sight, I didn't have an entirely kind of worked out idea about what the film or the projects were going to be at first, but one of the kind of underlying inspirations was that I wanted to make something that was about acoustic ecology, so environmental sound, and also how that relates to place narratives, so folklore, myth, and sort of the connection between these two things. And in the research for the project, like one of the things that I really kind of got fascinated with from the get-go was this idea, coming across it accidentally through research about this second sound, about, sounds that would be portents or prognostications of the future that folks would hear. And so I initially decided that that was going to be one separate project. It was going to be an entire project just about second sound and interviewing folks about that. And the documentary part that folks have seen, those interviews were more directed specifically about sound, acoustic ecology, and environmental sound, and the role that that plays in folks' lives. And then as I was editing the project, I realized that those other interviews were actually the interviews that would be in the film, and then they kind of mixed together. So it was a nice accident, but I couldn't see it clearly while I was making it.
There is that moment towards the beginning that a man says sight by ear, which I thought was like a wonderful way of tying in really early on. The title is Second Sight, but a lot of what the film goes deep in relation to Second Sight has to do with auditory elements. And so continuing this idea of sound, can you talk a little bit about the beginning, and not the very ending, but almost the very ending of the film, where I assume it's you are going up a hill and there's with a microphone, and then anyway, that's how did you decide to shoot that? Because you're not a particularly sort of performative type of person, I guess, and I don't imagine you sort of acting out many things in your films, and it's perhaps maybe one of the first times that you appear in your own films. And so how did you decide to do that? And then how did you decide to make it, to frame the whole work?
Well, just to go back to sort of kind of what you said at the beginning. So the title's The Two Sights, and the two sights is, it's both the sight by ear and like the visual prognostication. So it's both of those, but I think it's confusing. I think maybe it's not the best title or maybe it's just because we're so ocular centric, we think of it just like in the visual realm. But it is both of these different sites throughout. And regarding like the opening and the closing shot with the microphone setup, I'd initially planned on it being somebody else that would do that setup, but I never got around to it. I couldn't find somebody to do it. And that was the last shot that I took. So that's why it's me. I think the film ran out after that, which is like when you see at the end, that's the final roll that I shot. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do that is I like framing the film with these two different kinds. This is kind of dorky, but these two different kinds of like cinematic representation. So you have this kind of like one more symbolic or metaphoric where it's like asynchronous, and then when the microphone gets hit, you kind of move into this spatial dimension. So it's kind of framing the different kind of forms of representation that sound and image can create. And then it's also kind of framing that it is like a construction. And, really comes from an older film. There's a film from the 90s by Peter Mettler called Picture of Light. That was like one of a documentary that I saw really early on, probably like 19 or 20, and really influeed me. Not the voiceover part of it, but like the kind of the overall use of sound within that piece. Because there's moments where you feel like it's diegetic, but it's not. It's just like really clever mix of it's Jim O'Rourke's music, and it's almost this kind of imaginary sound of the Northern Lights at parts. But there's a moment in the film where the sound person is walking, and it is all of this sound that is this kind of more musical sound, and the representation is very metaphoric. And then he hits the mic, and you kind of like pop into this really immersive space. And I always liked that moment, and I thought that it would be interesting to use that at the beginning as a film, because for me, the film, when I was making it, was directly about sound. So that was a way to sort of kind of like make that gesture at the beginning. In the performative element, not so much do I do that on a regular basis, but I was just by myself. And then I thought if it was backlit, it would be just abstract enough. But then I guess I have, you can see my silhouette or whatever.
Perhaps in the same vein of the performative, or like the directed or whatever, all the interviews and all the people that appear seem to be captured sort of in a very, at least the process of capturing seems quite, let's say, more traditional, in that you're not directing people, or you're not telling people what to say or what to do. So is that the only moment in the entire film, would you say, that is more sort of action, go, cut, and then repeat, or that is more fictional, let's say?
Yeah. Well, there's a few moments that are like that actually, that I would just kind of, convince whoever was with me at the time to be able to do some of that stuff. So at the end, that's my friend David with the flashlight at the very end, who's a hydrologist who I met just like walking out on the moors, and he was kind enough to kind of do that, and we spent a lot of time together with him, sort of kind of showing me different things that were happening, and another part of it is my partner, the person like standing next to the car. So those elements are like highly fictional, and they were kind of images that I had in my mind that I'd collected. I do a lot of drawing when I'm working, and those were sort of kind of like some of the images that I did want to add to kind of create not like really strong elements of narrative, but like intimations of narrative that might resonate with the story in some way.
And perhaps just to go a little bit back to the beginning, into this idea of the two sides with when you hit the microphone, because that moment sort of sets up this idea that the audio exists in two places. Like you're looking at one image, you feel like the first audio belongs to that image because that's how you're perceiving it, and then suddenly the audio changes, the image stays the same. So you have the sense that there are more than one layer of audio in one space, let's say, which is kind of later echoed by like the different experiences of people listening to things of the future. So I guess what I want to see if you can talk a little bit about sort of this general, how do you take sort of like this strange phenomenon of the two sides and the way people describe it, and then use kind of the ideas behind that, because I feel that the film is full of sort of structural things or things that are done in the fabrication of a film that are sort of inspired by the two sides. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, I think, well, it's like through the editing process, like finding certain parts of a story that would resonate, but then it's also like structurally trying to kind of arrange it so that it's like, if there's a pattern where it's not overlapping, so you're kind of like retrospecting to break the pattern, and sometimes they meet up and sometimes they don't, but primarily the structure was to kind of have things that were not lining up temporally. So you would either kind of be retrospecting back or sort of kind of like remembering something that you'd seen, so that you're kind of playing, this structural sort of cinematic second sight. That's something that I was interested in. I think maybe you and I had talked about this at an earlier point, but I really love Hollis Frampton's nostalgia in that sense, where you have these images that, you see the image, but you're hearing the audio from the previous image, and then you're constantly in this state where you're retrospecting. And I like that tension. I think but it's interesting also to kind of break the pattern at parts too. I think it's kind of fun. So there are moments like, where the fella Duncan is talking about seeing the horse, like that's kind of like on the nose, like you see the horse, well, he's talking about it. But in other instances, or you see the house when the fella Donald John is talking about the fire, but for the most part, you're kind of in this tension where you're kind of retrospecting. So.
Yeah, also because you don't do it in a systematic way, let's say the way Hollis Frampton would do it in Nostalgia. And perhaps this non-systematic way of doing it, like the fact that you're not doing a systematic way, resembles a bit more the actual experience of second sight, where people cannot say it's always the same. It always manifests itself in a similar fashion, but like every time the stories come through, they're all very different and unique to one another. Like the way, I thought it was so beautiful when the person that's listening to German and French, because then later the radio arrives, or the story of the big bird, that then it's the helicopter, and then we see the helicopter in a way that we didn't expect to see it, I guess. There's like a crash. Can you talk a little bit perhaps about those, maybe the helicopter idea? What had you filmed that it's so specific that you have that image of the helicopter, and they mentioned this story?
Mhm.
Had you filmed before the helicopter and you tried to find that story, or vice versa, or was it purely coincidental?
No, so that story also kind of came later because like the helicopter was filmed on US and the story is from Lewis. And for the first part of, I think I did like maybe 4 shoots. The first 2 I was primarily in US, and then I went to Lewis afterwards. And so that story came later, was from a person who actually was like Maggie, who was like renting a room from when I was like working up there. She told me that story, and she had all these because she actually collects stories there, and so it was in the editing process. This for me in the editing process. I'm collecting all of these things. There wasn't a lot of moments where I had something from an interview and then went out to look for it, because I would do the interview and then I would kind of, forget about it in some ways, which sounds strange, but it's like, I had a lot going on and I was focusing on the collecting the kind of like location elements. And I did a lot of interviews, and then, in the editing process, I was collecting these things together. And some of the resonances are kind of, uncanny, like that's helicopter it is a helicopter from a salmon farm that crashed. And so it's like, very much like her story and what she's talking about. But it was not, I just didn't have the time or the energy to kind of go back through all of the interviews and log them. And they're long interviews too, like some of them are like 2 hours. So it was more, maybe that sounds crazy to work that way, but
Can you talk about the interview process? There's moments in which where a woman starts singing, a man starts whistling, I think. Are these things that you are sort of suggesting, or are these things that they just offer you, let's say?
no, so the with the woman that's whistling, so Susan, I met her, I was trying to find the whale that's in the film. I was trying to find that for like a week because it kept washing up on different parts of the shore. And so I met her when I was walking, and she said I asked her about doing an interview because she had told me about this threshold singing, like singing to folks after they had passed away. And then she was like, if I see you again, I'll think about doing an interview. And then I ran into her again because I was walking. She walks the same beach, and we did this interview. It was a really long interview, and in the process of doing that, I didn't ask her to sing. She volunteered to sing, and she hadn't sang in years. That was kind of one of the nice things that came out of the project, because afterwards she wrote me and she'd started up doing this again and had joined a choir in where she lives. I can't remember where she lives now, if it's like Leeds or but that just kind of came out of that process. And I decided to use it and made sure she was okay with it, because it was a very sort of kind of tender situation, I think, by the time we got to that point in the interview. And then the fellow that's whistling, Alec, somebody had told me about him, that he used to do this, but he didn't really do it now because he was just sort of kind of self-conscious about being able to still do it as well as he had once done it. And what was interesting about that is he was sort of skeptical of what I was up to, and at that point I wasn't able to really describe what I was doing. I was just making a film about sound, and he was just like, well, what about it exactly? And I didn't know. And when I'd interviewed him, he asked to listen to it, and I had 2 recorders, and I'd accidentally recorded him listening to it, and he started to whistle back to the recording. So then that's like those are both of those recordings. So they kind of like loop back over on themselves. So he's listening to himself, and then he's whistling, and he starts to whistle in this kind of more abstract way, and then it kind of into a tune, and then it kind of comes back to this thing about bagpipe tunes from birdsong. So it was kind of a happy accident. But it's mostly just sitting around. Like I'm not good at doing interviews. So it was just sort of kind of sitting around for a long time, and yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were not sure what you were up to, and so you couldn't describe the people you were interviewing exactly what you were after. So, so two things. So you were not sure at the beginning that the film would be about this double side,
Yeah.
or the two sides. So that came through the interviews that people kept talking about this, or that came through something else.
Well, there's two sets of interviews, right? So I would interview somebody, and initially, because I was, the thing that I was trying to make the film about at the beginning was sound and like environmental sound, but trying to articulate that to folks, people were just kind of more like, well, what do you mean about sound? Like bird sound, like wind, like what are you talking about? I was trying to kind of get into, how does the sound of their environment kind of affect them? But they were not so much interested. Some folks were. And then, we would do these interviews, and at the end of it, out of curiosity, because I was thinking about this other project, because I'd come across this idea of second sound, I would be like, have you heard anything about this? And or I've come across this term. Have you heard anything about this particular term? It was like the Gaelic version of the second sound. Most people would say no, and then some people would, go off on this other thing about, something that they knew about that, or another story in relation to that, a ghost story or something like that. But because we had done this interview beforehand, it was about, I was also asking a lot of questions about light. So people were really attuned to sound and light in this previous interview, and some of which were kind of these failed interviews, that those other stories kind of like took on this more sensorial element to them by accident.
By association to the previous
yeah, because we'd already spent so much time talking about, sound and the kind of emphasis on that, I think, really kind of colored the interviews that came afterwards.
I mean, it seems like not calculated at all. Like the process seems not calculated, yet it seems quite smart to try to talk about the senses as much as possible, then ask about a concrete question, and then suddenly they're talking about it in terms of.
I'll make a note of that for next time.
No, it's quite. So now that we're talking a bit more about practical things, so do you mind talking a little bit about, do you go alone? Do you do everything by yourself? Do you shot on 16 millimeters? Can you talk a little bit about sort of the equipment that you bring with you? How do you use it? Does other people help you out?
Yeah, I mean, no, I just kind of work on by myself, and I think it's also more down to the sort of the way that I work, and that, for me, it's like the filmmaking process. It's not something that's kind of figured out beforehand. It's like through the action of making it that you're having these encounters, and that's like, shaping how you collect material. And then of course the meaning is made, for me at least, in the editing process. And then in terms of 16 millimeter, it's just something that I've shot on for a long time. I've shot on it now for like 20 years. And I think in relation to working with sound, I make really, really long sound recordings. In this project especially, I moved from making recordings that were like an hour to 24 hours to 3-4 days, to the point now we're making a recording for like a year. And that's kind of a place where I'm just sort of, out of control, I think. And then with 16 millimeter, for me, it's a way, it's like, Tacita Dean talks about it in relation to like having these particular parameters, like artistic parameters. And I think like 16 millimeter is that for me. It's like it provides this structure beforehand that it's kind of creatively limiting a lot of different possibilities. And it kind of forces me to actually able to finish a film. And then the limitations of it that are dictated by, light and things like that is like an additional parameter. And, because the sound is at the forefront of my work, I think of the visual element kind of backwards. And that for me, it's like, I think of the cinematographic element as like notation. So for me, the films are like these compositions, like these long sound compositions, and I'm collecting images as notation to structure them. Just like, you know, if a cellist is reading score or something like that, I think sound design in cinema is like you're reading images. So that's kind of the way that I'm working. I think of it as notation. So it's also, because it's double system too, and because there are these limitations, then my days get split in half. So, you know, I only work until it's dark, and then I usually collect sound during the evening and into the night, which is actually a nicer time to work as well, because there's less anthropogenic sound. And it kind of allows me to work this way.
Do you ever shoot synchronously, like synchronous sound to the?
I mean, there's elements of synchronous sound in the film. Not often. There's when the folks are doing the psalm singing in the church, like that's synchronized. What else is synchronized in the film? Not much. No, I think I enjoy synchronizing it with other. You know, a lot of the sound that you hear is from like a different month, a different year. I enjoy, you know, sort of structuring it in post.
I mean, at the end of it, it's just so, it's like it's such an interesting subject, the two sides, because in some ways, even though we're talking about practical things, it just keeps coming back to me, because it seems like so many elements of your process have to do also, maybe in other films as well, not just here, but have to do with this shift between what is in front of you and what you're hearing. That can, I mean, just in practical terms, the fact that nothing that you're looking at, except in the choir scene, the sound of everything that you're listening to has nothing to do with the images that you're actually looking at. You sync them later, the way this second sound side operates, or the way 16 millimeter works, that you're shooting this negative, but you end up watching this positive, or all this sort of different elements. So maybe it's reading into it too much, but it seems that this way for you of working, where you spend time doing one thing and then you do the next, and you build slowly, and things that you in the future resonate with things that you do previously. All of this has a lot to do with a subject matter, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I find it quite fascinating.
Well, thanks.
Did you, by any chance, I was wondering if you recorded images of the people that you interviewed, which would be like the most normal thing to do, I guess. If you're going to make a film and you do interviews, most people assume that you record pictures too.
Yeah, there's not so much. There was one, I did some filming with, there was a group of folks in Lewis that do this psalm singing as well from the pier. There's traditionally, there would be this kind of like psalm boat singing, where somebody would sing, to the shore, like they would have this exchange. So I filmed a bit of that, but it was just like, it wasn't something that worked within the film. I ended up using the recordings later for another like sound only project. And I filmed with Duncan, who was, the fellow that tells the story about seeing the horse, and also talks about losing his dog at the beginning. I sang, his father was a bard and sang in had all sorts of different songs. So I recorded him singing a song, but I didn't end up using it. But the museum ended up using it for something else. It didn't end up fitting. But I think by not kind of filming folks with the interviews, I think it helped in terms of making the kind of interviews more open. And there was a film that was shot on burner in the 1970s that people don't really care so much now, but I think at the time folks were, maybe they were a little bit sensitive about it. So I think, like, there's a long memory for that there. I think people were kind of more sensitive about being filmed, at least on Uist and burner. But yeah, it's also too, I don't know. I just don't really like filming people. I feel like it feels uncomfortable for me. So I prefer just like talking. but it, you know, I realize that that's strange, but that's just, yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about the post-production, about the the structure of the film? How do you, I know that you go through many cuts, and so how do you arrive at this structure, or how did you arrive at this structure? Or can you describe a little bit of the whole process?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was like 50 cuts. I think you saw probably like 20 of them or something, or you said you saw 20.
No.
It was just kind of, you know, I have like a good group of friends that I'm able to share stuff with and give feedback. So it's like, you know, like you, like Andrea Busman, and, you know, different friends too that listen to the sound works as well, like my friend Josh, who's done all the mixing for or does the final like theater mix and stuff for the films. So it was just kind of like relaying different cuts to folks and kind of trying to find the weather of the film. And it, you know, the first sort of kind of the majority of the beginning cuts were the film was more sound focused, and then when I kind of it still remains sound focused, but when I switched it to these stories that, you know, I had made after the initial sound interviews, then it started to kind of get more of a form where it was working. And then structurally, I mean, maybe it doesn't seem like it, but it's just like the way that the interviews are laid out, there's they kind of start closer together and gradually get further and further apart structurally, like if you were to look at it on a timeline.
Can you describe that again? Sorry.
So it's just like the way that the composition, like the sound composition is working. It starts where the interviews are closer together and gradually they get further and further apart, and the kind of the environmental sound kind of encroaches on that. And, you know, my strategy primarily, like I was talking about before, was to think of it as a sound composition. So I was actually thinking about it in relation to, I really wanted to work a lot with dialogue in this particular project in a similar way that kind of Glenn Gould's radio documentaries work with dialogue, like Idea of North, for example, this contrapuntal use of voice, so having overlapping voice and creating these different rhythms and things where the listener is kind of like honing in on to these different parts of it. But I wanted to do that with the environmental sound, and I wanted to, you know, traditionally when you mix a film, you know, the dialogue is in the middle and it's the highest thing, and I wanted to sort of kind of like invert that and kind of blur that. But it was, the editing process was entirely based around you know, this composition, and then using the images to structure that so it was like, you know, making sense.
And do you work on both sort of simultaneously, or do you create first like a sequence of sound or a sequence of images, and then you lay one or the other on
It's
top?
like a sequence, like a little crystal of something. It's like something kind of crystallizes in the timeline around something, and then I start to build the sound out from that. And then also the sound comes out of it entirely when I'm kind of, you know, some of this, not so much this one, maybe more other projects, but kind of processing the sound, working with, I use a program called Ableton Live, where it's sort of like a, you know, program primarily invented for DJing. But it's like, you know, you can play clips back live and loop them. It was kind of like working things out in that program, seeing what kind of juxtapositions, like what happens if I pitch something in relation to another sound. So, and then, you know, some kind of analog processing of sound through tape, and, you know, making all of these sort of sketches and then listening to them and seeing if they kind of hold up on their own, and then bringing them back into the project.
And so a lot of the sounds are, so you record the sounds and then you not only edit them and mix them, but you also manipulate and change the sort of the quality of the sound itself?
I have like rules. So like I only will do stuff with you know, so I'll pitch things, I'll use EQ, I'll use tape manipulation. For this particular one, there are no like really kind of strong effects like reverb or something like that. And I also, on this project in particular, really started to, it was a project where I learned Isotope. So this software that you can use, I think I've shown you this before, but it's basically like Photoshop for sound. So it does a spectral analysis of different sounds, and you can remove certain frequencies, you can amplify certain frequencies, and I really got into using that. And not for the first kind of, when it premiered in February, there was like one particular type of sound design, and I came back and actually changed a lot of stuff because it wasn't, playing in 5.1. I was able to continue to work on it, and there's an album of the sounds from this as well. So I had gone back in, and when I cut the album, I'd gone back through all of the sounds and changed things and did isotope and brought a lot of sounds back into it, like different sounds that you weren't more prominent before, like the seal sounds and different bird sounds. So that was kind of where the most processing was through that program.
So I forgot to ask you some things about less technical and more about your experience and the process. You mentioned that you went more than once to film, right? Like it was not all filmed in one single session. And did you ever go back when you finished the film, and were you able to show it? Have the people that are in it, have they seen it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so I did like an installation version of this first that was like quite different. It was way longer, and that was installed for a month at the museum. So that was more community oriented, and folks came and we talked, and most of the people that were in the film have seen it. There's like one person that hasn't seen it because they're in Lewis. I need to make like a PAL DVD to send up there, because I initially had assumed that it was just going to show there, and I would have been my plan was to just go and then bring it to different folks, because some people aren't out and about. So it was like, I could bring it and show them on my computer or something like that, especially in some kind of the more isolated areas. But most of the folks did, because it was facilitated by the museum. So like a lot of the people that I was talking to as well, I had known folks at the museum and had seen different versions of it. And some people just weren't interested. So, which I don't blame them. So it's just not their thing.
Can you describe the installation?
Yeah, it was just so the museum, it's like an older structure. I can't remember what it was initially, but it's like an older stone building, and then it has kind of like a newer renovated part on it, and it's quite nice. And I was in the kind of like older part of it, and it was like just like a kind of very tall room with high ceilings, and it was just single channel stereo sound. It was nice. It was more sort of a kind of bespoke theater that folks could pop in and have a look. And then there was another part of the installation was I had a hydrophone set up that was a live radio broadcast. So there was a hydrophone very close to the museum. It's right in a port. So there was a hydrophone in a lobster creel, like a lobster pot, and that ran out to this device that connected back to Ethernet. And so it did a live broadcast of like the tides changing and kind of anthropogenic sound in the port, and also like the different kind of like fauna, like there's cod barking and all sorts of different sounds. And those sounds make it into the film as well. And that was installed in like a fishing hut. And for the opening, we had timed it so that like when a ferry came into port, so it was like, broadcasting through the radio into this hut, and you could hear the sound, the really harsh kind of sound of the ferry arriving.
So you were able to actually mix the environmental sounds into this film about.
Yeah. So it kind of used bits and pieces from both of those, majority from the installation. So.
There are a couple questions here already. One person is asking about sort of musical score. Since your focus in making the film was directly about sound, what role did the choice to omit a musical score play in crafting the film's sound?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, sound design for cinema and these types of sounds could be considered musical. So for me, that is, what it is. I think like having music on top of that somebody composed for me would be taking away from it, because it's like it is about specifically environmental sound, and that might not be musical in terms to somebody in terms of aligning to a particular scale or a particular method or concept, but I see it as sound design for cinema as a form of musique concrète or anecdotal music. I think it's music in itself.
Yeah, it's very musical, I guess, the score, even though without having a. This is also perhaps a good, difficult question. Although your camera generally maintains a distance from the subject, there are moments when it feels as if that distance is traversed, almost confrontationally, by animals looking directly at the camera. How did these moments come about? How do you position your camera within the discourse you present between traditional second sight and interfering technology?
That is a good question. The moments came about just because I had spent so much time walking in the same places. So after a while, you can kind of predict different things. Like it's even the deer that you see at the beginning of the film. Like I'd seen that deer a couple times. Like I knew that might happen. And so it's kind of, spending time in a place you're able to predict certain things that are going to happen. And that question disappeared.
It was about how you position sort of the machinery, I guess, of the camera in the discourse of. It was way better phrased than what I'm saying, but in relation to sort of the. Do you remember the question?
Yeah, I see it again. It was under answered.
Okay.
So that's how the moments came about, and then how do I position the camera within the discourse you present between traditional second sight and interfering technology? I don't know. I mean, I didn't really see the camera as interfering so much. Like, I mean, a lot of those shots too, especially with the animals, are like really kind of like long telephoto lens shots. I didn't feel like I was interfering with the landscape. I guess by my presence, I'm interfering. But I also kind of felt like I was, kind of more like encountering things and reacting. I wasn't like on a hunt for certain images per se. So,
and perhaps could you say if you present actually a discourse, or how do you position that idea that you're presenting a discourse between traditional second sight and interfering technology, or whether there is a kind of loss of the sensibility because of technology? Maybe that's not exactly a question, but I think it's interesting as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, maybe I'm just not getting this, but it's, the loss of second sight is directly tied together with the loss of the Gaelic language, which changes, with the loss of the Gaelic language and Gaelic oral history. There's a different kind of way of relating to the environment, and the environment's not enchanted, I think, at that particular level. But I didn't think, and of course that has some, or probably a huge effect from technology in terms of people migrating from the islands. And but I felt like this particular technology, like with film itself, is something that is aligned to the environment in a particular way. Like it is, you're basically kind of making a metal cast of light of that particular environment. So I feel like it kind of captures that presence. I don't know.
And perhaps in that line, just a quick about, do you have a sense of loss in any sense in this, of the space, that there is like a lot being, that you're capturing something, or you're trying, almost like you're preserving some cultural elements that are disappearing? Or do you find it, because the film works in both ways, it feels extremely lively at times, like, full of life, and at the same time it feels that on other moments it feels like there's a disappearing element of a whole culture, a whole understanding of the world.
Yeah, I mean, so there's all sorts of different stuff that's come about for this, like folks talking about that the Gaelic language will disappear within the next decade. And I felt that when I was recording these interviews, because a lot of the folks that I recorded with were like quite older, and one of the folks that I work with too, Maggie, who's in the film quite a bit in her interviews, she was working on collecting these different stories from communities, especially place names, like Gaelic place names, there's like this kind of like almost like microscopic detail in certain places of like varying place names and those connecting oral histories, and those are disappearing. And so it feels like that there is an urgency on the ground there for people to collect these things and, you know, make maps of these names and collect the histories. And it did feel like when I was collecting these stories that, yeah, like some of them, you know, are being preserved that may not have been told on a regular basis, so there's not a recording or an archival element to it, but then also with the environmental sound as well. So, you know, you're collecting different sounds that are disappearing. And, you know, the Hebrides is pretty far north and is kind of, you know, one of these places that's at the forefront of climate change, and you see a lot of impact in species there, especially with the bird populations. So, you know, you are quite aware of that, I think, when you're making it, and you're collecting things that are disappearing.
There's a nice question here, a personal question in a way, but nice. Did making a film with references to Second Sight affect you on a spiritual level? And was your framework of your personal beliefs changed? Did you sense a different energy in the Hebrides, how do you say that, than in other places? Was any of your own experience what you might think of a second sight or a synchronistic experience?
Mm.
And then thank you for these gorgeous natural and dreamlike images throughout your film.
So that is a nice question. Thank you. No, I mean, I think that the film is like, for me, making it was like a cinematic second sight. Like I, you know, collected these different interviews and the images and the sound, and I was pretty sick when I was making it, especially at the beginning of it, and I wasn't able to really kind of focus on my memory was sort of kind of shot in this first part of it. And I feel like, you know, the making of the film had an element to that. And I don't know if the framework of my personal beliefs has changed because of that, but I mean, I was definitely marked by the place. It's a very special place with very special people. And I don't know if there's necessarily like a different energy to the place, but there's definitely a different way, for the most part, that at least folks that are from there relate to the landscape. And I think a lot of it has to do with the oral tradition. And thanks for that comment.
What's the patch you have set up on the modular rack behind you?
I think what's in there right now is just it's like a sampler going into some filters and a distortion module.
Can you talk about the act of observations through sound and image? What are you looking for through these media? What does it reveal to you?
I'm gonna take off my headphones. This is like so weird. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Can you talk about the act of observations for sound and image? What are you looking for through this media? What does it reveal to you? I mean, using sound and image, like I feel like it's mediating my experience, but I feel like it's also a way to kind of put myself into these situations and have these experiences. And you know, the observational element of it, I feel, I don't know, I'm kind of trying, I think, in my own work to sort of kind of, at least with the sound element, to kind of move away from observing while making and kind of composing while listening after the fact. Like there's two very different processes, I think, of the filming and the sound recording. I think maybe the observation through image is something that's maybe more present and direct, and the sound recording is more removed, and just slowly kind of trying to work myself away from like removing myself like further and further from that. And I think the media, what it reveals to me, especially with this project, kind of more than other projects, is just I think with all the projects, I've been kind of focusing on wider spaces and larger areas. And with each project, I kind of get like smaller and kind of like more and more local, down to like the point right now where I'm just like recording from like a single tree. And I think it's just, especially in this particular environment where there is so much focus on the local and this kind of like expansion of, you know, the environment in a different way that I'm used to with the place names. Just observing how much can happen in a smaller space. So I think for sure that that's what this project revealed to me. And you know, kind of focusing on something that's in a smaller, more concentrated way, and then also kind of like a longer way, like kind of like leaving things to record and kind of like setting it and moving away from it. Of course, with the 16 millimeter, I couldn't do that, but I mean, the majority of the work on this was spent in sound recording.
Could you talk a bit about the affective resonances of the film and their relation to sound and image?
Sorry, I'm like losing my brain power. I was teaching all day outside and it was like -6 here. These are all like such really intelligent questions, and I'm just kind of like, sorry, where did that question go? Is it still open?
I can read it again if you want.
The affective resonances of the film in their relation to sound and image. I'm not sure. I don't know. How would you describe that, Nico?
It's an abstract question to some degree.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Sorry, Kaya.
Okay, we can always come back if we have some ideas about it. Were you influenced at all by Laura Marx's work on tactility and embodied touch? My experience watching and listening to the film was so visceral. The graininess was really special.
No, I wasn't in particular, but I think, you know, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about the film, you know, it does have this, I think, yeah, there's the element of the graininess of the film where you can see this kind of the physicality of it. But for me, it is like, it's very, I don't know, it's almost like more sculptural or something. I don't want to like fetishize working with film because I use it mostly in some ways too for like practical reasons, but you know, it is like this imprint. It's almost like a cast of the light of this environment, its topography. But no, I wasn't influenced by Laura Marx.
I mean, but perhaps it's not necessarily the fact that it's film or 16 millimeters, but it has to do with the time of the day that you shoot at, the space itself, the kind of the angle at which you shoot. I mean, there's so much more to the cinematography than just the fact that it's celluloid, right? So a lot of
I hope so.
no, what I mean is that a lot of this tactility and embodied touch that Hannah here is mentioning comes through perhaps a lot, not just for the fact that it's, I mean, I know it's not just because it's 16, but because of sort of your approach to the cinematography, perhaps.
I was just saying that because you and I were talking yesterday about, because the next film I'm making is digital. So it's just like, you know, questions and anxieties around working that way.
I was going to ask you about that, sort of like not necessarily about only about your next project, but this idea of shifting technologies. I mean, it seems that different technologies like the rack behind you or like the 16 millimeter camera you've spoken about are somewhat at the center of your work because that's your crew in a way. I mean, many people work with other people, but you just have these machines with you. But so changing those machines in future work, like having a digital camera instead of, have you thought a bit about how that affects your future work? Or how it really doesn't, and it's just another.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the transition to digital is kind of like, it's part of this thing of sort of being able to move away, and in some ways of not always having to be present while filming. There's an element for that and like being able to use duration sort of kind of more so than with 16mm, which are really kind of just limited to, a maximum of 11 minutes on the mag that I was using for this film. But also just kind of like, making it more mobile and flexible in that way. Like this was really not a flexible way to work, just in sheer weight of things. So I think it's about trying to find ways that are like more efficient and allow you to kind of like spend less time like actively observing with the camera, like observing through your own kind of like, field work and time spent in place, but also being able to kind of like remove yourself from the like, you're still framing it and choosing a lens and whatnot, but kind of remove yourself from entirely being present every time you're shooting.
Okay, just it's almost 8 o'clock, so I think we'll end it there. Kathy's back here.
Yes, I want to thank you, Josh and Nico. This has been such a fascinating and far-ranging conversation, and so much about process and your approach to sound and place. So I really thank you both for your film and for the conversation about it.
Thanks, thank you. Thank you,
yeah,
Kathy.
just
Thank
really
you, Nico.
wonderful. I also want to take a moment to thank Nat and Justine and Jeff and Chris for all of their behind the scenes work. And for all of you out in the audience, ask you to check our website, bampfa.org, to see what other films and conversations we are streaming. The entire Documentary Voices series is now posted. As you may know, there's a new Brazilian cinema series, films by Ulrika Oninger, by Wong Kar-wai, special film programs of works from our vaults. And we've been in the process of uploading lots of recent releases and restorations for the last few days. So now's a really good time to take a look. So I want to thank you for joining us. We really hope to see you soon. In the meantime, please take care.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.